Hello, my name is Andy Weinstein, founder and CEO of Godot and host of What Are You Waiting For, a podcast by Godot. We have today Kaihan Krippendorff on the call, who will tell us about deep thinkers and a way to reimagine organizations. But I would love to hear what made him undertake this path and what is this path. So, Kaihan, give us a quick intro and what do you do?
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Andy. It's great to be with you again. So I do two things. I write books and do research. My wife calls me a for-profit academic, and I give speeches. And then I also run a peer network of chief strategy officers and chief innovation officers of large enterprises. I also live in Miami. I've got 3 kids and a bunch of other little things I do.
So how do you become a paid academic? Since I feel like every academic either wants to chase their passion or get paid. You're somewhere in between the two. How do you get on
Yeah.
that?
I mean, I could probably get paid more if I picked a different passion, maybe. But I did happen to pick a passion that I think is a valuable one to unpack, how to enable greater innovation in organizations, how to come up with bigger ideas. But I really followed my passion and my curiosity. My dad was a professor at the same university for 58 years, the longest serving professor in the history of the University of Pennsylvania. And he was just driven by questions. And I think that rubbed off on me or inspired me. I just happened to have chosen something that I think can also be a making money thing as opposed to, I don't know, something that is less so.
Can you give me a story about like what was your aha moment to kind of follow this, or your aha moment of what made you understand that you were a curious being?
Well, I think I had a very boring summer one year. I was living in the Dominican Republic, and I'd gone there before business school with a friend. And although I had friends there, I didn't have a lot of, like, say, weekend friends. They were kind of like family friends. So on the weekends, I didn't have much to do. And in flying to the Dominican Republic, at one point, I went through a bookstore. It was in Coconut Grove in Miami, which I happen to live in now, but I haven't lived here for very long. And it was a translation of these 36 Chinese metaphors. And long story short, I just got infatuated with this text, this ancient text. And since I had nothing to do, I would go into the office on the weekends, and because this was way back when you had to go to the office to get the internet. So I would go there and I would look up cases, and I just created a big Word document classifying business cases from Business Week, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, according to these 36. And I think the moment was later I go back to business school, finish my first year at Columbia, and then my second year, I'm talking to a professor, Catherine Harrigan, who still teaches there today. And I showed her what I was doing, and she said, "You're writing a book." And it was that statement that opened up to me this possibility that, oh, maybe I could write a book. And that is what then put me on the path of writing the first book.
So you got touch with serendipity of just talking to a professor, and then and that was based off of essentially another moment of serendipity where you found these Chinese metaphors that you could apply to business cases because you didn't have a social network there.
Right, right. Oh, yeah, sure. Like one moment of serendipity leads to the next, leads to the next. And then I guess a possibility then emerges, right? A
Mhm.
small possibility to a bigger. But yeah, these serendipitous connections.
Well, it's funny because I lived many years in Wenatchee, and I would say I had the same type of
Sorry,
situation.
where's Wenatchee?
Wenatchee is in central Washington. It's called the
Uh-huh.
Apple capital of the world. It's where our Pepsi franchise is, and it's
Huh.
where we want to convert the Apple waste into hydrogen and food grade
Right.
CO2.
Okay, great.
It
Yep.
is like, in a weird way, the epicenter to my world, but nobody else's, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I was working there after moving from New York. So you go from New York, where essentially every single person you meet becomes a weekend friend, and your ability to develop a social network is super easy. In Wenatchee, it was very difficult. I was this kind of socially awkward person, but what I ended up doing on the drives to and from Wenatchee, I would go from Seattle to Wenatchee and Wenatchee to Seattle, basically on the weekend, so that I could have weekend friends. And in that process, I would use the drive time to think things through. And at night, I write things down and I create these things called my midnight musings. And I've had multiple people say, "Why don't you make this into a book?" I actually just made it into a GBT so that I now have essentially years of thinking aggregated in a way that's much better organized than I could do in my own book. What made you go the next step to like write a book and then try to actually make a career from book writing versus anything else?
I think the simple explanation of how innovation happens or change happens is that there's a vision and you work backward from the vision and then you build the parts of the vision. You break it down to pieces and solve the little things. I think that, I don't know, maybe that's like half of the time, I think. I think the other half of the time you work on little pieces and it's for intrinsic motivation. You know, Albert Einstein says that play is the greatest form of research. I think for me, in my experience, has been more, I just played on the next thing and the next thing. It's not that I said, I'm going to build a career giving speeches. I didn't know that was a career. That's not something that people tell you about in school or that your college counselor tells you about as a thing to pursue. But there are thousands and thousands of people that do. There's a very simple business model behind it. It's not unlike a business model of a hairdresser or a waiter, right? It's just recurring clients. I don't know when it was that I had the plan that I would do this. I think it was first, oh, I can write a book. How do I write a book? Let's get a book on, I got the Complete Idiot's Guide to Getting Published, and I just executed that step by step. And then I sent out self-addressed stamped envelopes to return envelopes to 40 different agents to try to find an agent. Out of the 40, 2 of them said yes. And then out of that one, I started, finishing the book. And then she started pitching it. It took like 3 years to get the first book deal. It took us 7 years from the time that I started writing the book to the time that it was published. 7 years. And then I thought that was going to be it. I thought, oh, one book done. So that's why I quit my job. I was at McKinsey at the time and consulting, and they weren't going to really support me and support in promoting the book. So I didn't think I was ever going to write another book. So I quit. And then I needed to get paid. So I worked at a nonprofit to get kind of like half pay. And then I just started trying to sell workshops, and I did it for free. And then I did it for $200 and I did it for $500 and just started trying to feed myself really. And it was not like a plan. It was just one thing leading to the next thing, leading to the next thing.
Yeah, I think that's hilarious because I actually ended up, people ask me all the time, how did I get into large scale waste energy as someone with a background in Pepsi bottling?
Hmm.
Well, quite frankly, my vision was how do I turn everything raw to waste and back into reuse? And that's been my vision for a very long time. I just was focusing on the raw to waste side of how do I add more products to a Pepsi truck and maximize that. But once I
Hmm.
realized that a Pepsi truck is not as valuable as if you sell unless you sell the fuel and the fizz, and I can solve those by taking the waste streams that are generated by producing the products that go on that truck. And I that was one of these like aha moments is like I can complete the circular economy with that. And now I'm just filling in blanks into my own value chain, and so I'm solving my own problems. Versus for you, what it sounds like is each one of these things was like, I wanted to write a book and I want to make this actually work as something successful. It takes a lot longer than I expected. And along the way, I ended up learning X, Y, and Z, which then became essentially, I'm guessing, the fuel for your next book or your next campaign.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's because the next thing seems bigger than the first one. And it's easier to like just get your head around the immediate one. Yeah, my first book was The Art of the Advantage. It's about these 36 stratagems. And then I had a passion for my next book. The publisher of the next book is a really weird book. It was based off of a ancient Chinese framework for change of these 5 different phases. And I think that this explains more in a more useful and elegant way, kind of the S curve. And so I started working on that, but they didn't buy into that book. They really liked my first book. So I had to sell them the rights to do the paperback version of my first book. So they were really wanting a new version of my first book. So then that got me the next two books. But the Way of Innovation was the book that has sold the least and that I'm the most passionate about. And then after that, I got interested in a different topic, which was about entrepreneurship, people who innovate from inside established companies. And what I showed, what I believed, and then I showed was that internal innovators are the primary drivers of innovation in society, although we mostly talk about entrepreneurs. And then I had another, then I think then I started getting a little bit of a reputation. So there were people who wanted to write with me. So my next book was a co-authored book on proximity. And we do have not a Pepsi, but a Coca-Cola case in there. Yeah. And so then I got, it's just like, I just have this stream of interesting things to study. And I think that comes from the peer network of chief innovation officers and strategy officers. And I talk to them all the time. We've got 100 of them. And so I have 200 conversations at least every year about what's on their agenda, what's on their minds, what are they thinking about for the future. And that's like a big, long research pipeline of questions.
Awesome. Yeah. And when you talked about intrapreneur versus entrepreneur, and I want to kind of focus on that for a little bit, and then we can get back to, because I have a buddy of mine, Ryan, who his philosophy is intrapreneurs essentially are going to be the more successful entrepreneurs because they understand all of the different inputs that are real world inputs on a business versus the conveyed inputs. And I see this, for example, all the time in the beverage space or any spaces. People assume this business works like that business, and they don't understand that every stakeholder has a different perspective, different incentive structure, different objective structure, and entrepreneurs are able to kind of inherently understand that because we've dealt with those customers in many, or those stakeholders in many cases, for years at a time versus days at a time. How did you find intrapreneurship versus entrepreneurship, and how did you go down that path? Like, what was like, oh, this is my key signal?
No, I think maybe it was my wife. She is an attorney and she has a big job, and she was at MasterCard and now she's the general counsel for Televisa Univision. And she is creative and passionate, and she's a big thinker, future thinker. And I knew other people like that were working inside established companies, and they were making really great things happen. And I kind of wanted to serve them. I love those people. And yet the stories that we mostly tell in popular media about entrepreneurship is really a young white guy at Harvard who quits school, goes to the West Coast, puts together a small team, goes into a garage and creates something and then disrupts. Almost every story is that. Mm-hmm. And so what are the chances that that is actually the truth? What is the chances that to be an impactful innovator, you need to be a young white college dropout who goes to California? We know that's not true, right? So the reason that I think we tell those stories is that is a story that sells books, that sells articles, that gets eyeballs. And the problem, and so you could say, oh, that's okay. You're just selling a product. This is what the market wants. The problem is that my daughter is reading those stories and she's being told, no, I can't be the innovator. All these people who have chosen corporate careers are reading those stories and say, oh, I'm not an innovator. And that is a problem on twofold, is it robs people of being able to develop a identity as being the innovator and celebrating them as an innovator. But then it robs society, because what I'll show is that 70% of society's most transformative innovations have come from intrapreneurs, not from entrepreneurs. And so if we did not have intrapreneurs, look, we would not be on this phone because we would not have the internet. You would not have a mobile phone. You would not be able to send an email. You would not be able to write a Word document. You would not get a stent. You would not get an MRI. We'd live in a radically inferior world if it weren't for the power and potential of entrepreneurs. So I think that this is a problem for society as well.
I,
So that sort of came together. Yeah.
yeah, I totally agree. Sorry for cutting you off
Yeah.
there.
No, no, no. I know that you
I
see
I
this. You believe this. Yeah.
I think one of the things I created a, a term that I just use, but it's basically a culture of the last follower.
Well,
So always addressing, we're creating systems that we're hoping that somebody follows us, but we don't expect them to ever be part of the innovation, right? Versus a first follower tends to be the one that validates a leader, right? And a leader is the person who's crazy until there's a first follower, and that first follower is able to recruit a secondary layer of followers.
I love that.
And I see this at business school when got my MBA at Fordham, and we almost everybody who went into corporate never really were the innovators. And part of it was because to do really well in following instruction is following instruction. And we're creating companies that are all command based. I command you to do this. If you don't do this, then I will fire you. And we think we're getting more and more secure and risk-free by doing that, but we actually create way more risk because we eliminate that opportunity to be a first follower, to be a leader, because we're trying to create these companies filled with last follower culture. And that kind of brings me actually to one of our mutual connections, which you were like, you should meet Rita
Yeah.
McGrath.
Yes.
And the next week, I think it was like the next
You just
week.
happened to be with her at a conference, right?
Yeah, I just happened to be at a conference and
Amazing.
there she was. And I was like, Rita, we got to talk. And what's funny is just on the podcast that we just made public last week with Joanne Garbin, she
Yes.
brought up Rita McGrath as well. I think it's also kind of highlights another problem in the system is there are actually very few innovative thinkers in the system. So that when people recognize that you are innovative thought leader, whatever, you end up being able to circulate that knowledge. And not to, you know, I love Rita McGrath. I think her writing and her permissionless organization is the right future. I'm just thinking as a bigger problem when you talk about your systems, right? We don't have enough innovators. We don't have enough leaders. And we see this in a weird way in the response to DEI in businesses. The companies that have kept DEI practices have grown. Those that have kind of gone the way of like Target, they have just lost a lot of their customers because they did not realize the value of goodwill.
Mm.
And so yeah, very long way of getting is how do we make sure that we create cultures in the future that allow for individuality and participation so that we are not creating last follower cultures?
Well, I think there's some hope with AI. We're going to do a session tomorrow with Antonio Nieto, who was the chair of the Project Management Institute and has written a number of very influential books on project management. He's sort of like one of the great respected experts in project management. And what he's saying is that right now, 70% of what a company does is operations. And, would you use your language, for operations, we need the follower to take the plan and kind of execute the plan. But automation is going to allow us to operate businesses with just 30% of our time and resources, which allows us to do a lot more projects, which is a lot more starting and completing things. And so I think that's one force that is going to, for the progressive company, they're going to say, I have this talent and these capabilities. Let me shift them to creating new things, new products and new channels, new pricing strategies, new physical experiences, new ways of recruiting and organizing. And then others will say, oh, I'm just going to save 50% or 40% of my cost because I don't have to pay people to operate it. But maybe we'll see a bifurcation. I think the companies that activate more innovators are going to then just start iterating faster, and the gap will widen, and they'll be prove that that's the right approach.
Absolutely. I believe the technology solve is here. It's just that people haven't realized that it's already arrived, right?
Mm.
And I think with natural language processing, we have the ability to kind of discern who knows what and who can contribute what to a problem. So I think in our first discussion, we talked about my very unique org structure that's
Yeah.
around a graph database versus a traditional tree database. So
Mm-hmm.
tree database is your hierarchies. It kind of branches out. It looks really good on paper. In reality, we all have sat there and been like, why do I need to get this person's approval for this project? This doesn't remotely touch them. Besides, it's under their purview. They don't have any real information on the system. Why don't we just have the people that are direct stakeholders touch it? And that will reduce the communication overhead, right?
It's the community. Yes, the
Because
communication area was huge. Yeah.
communication overhead is why our current structures are
Yes.
70% operations, is because we need to get something done and then we need to share it with these different teams
Yes.
and slowly but surely get across a stage gate.
Yes.
And whether we realize that that is happening or not is a whole nother thing. But everybody builds these stage gate processes as a way to reduce risk. There's a
Yes.
reason why you want to have the lawyer in the room. There's a reason why you want to have the accountant in the room. We just tend to organize them last versus first. And I
Yes.
think companies that are going to move the fastest and are going to be able to capture a market share in a very dynamic way are going to be almost like liquid. They'd be able to adhere to all the processes and problems and be able to create a stage gate on the front end using technology versus our current system, which is using it's almost like stagnant relationships in a dynamic environment. So with those, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have not thought about or studied or developed a possible solution for this as much as you have at all. But one aspect of the dilemma that I have been researching for the last 5 months has been about the difficulty in matching needs with solutions. That is to say, an organization exists to solve problems, and the person who sees the problem often is not the same person who has the answer to the problem. And as companies scale, it becomes harder for them to match the two. They become inefficient idea marketplaces. It's harder to search and discover needs and solutions. It's harder to match them. It's harder to value them. It's harder to prioritize them, and it's harder to activate action on them. And so across all those five, scale gets in the way, and that middle management layer, that operation, that what you call it, the management layer, the control layer, gets so big that it naturally falls in on itself. Which is so interesting about your model is that you have a control mechanism that doesn't have to scale faster than the organism does. Why do elephants move more slowly? Why are whales in water? As an organism gets big, I don't know, the proportion of mass to strength or something like that is think.
Yeah, and it mimics actually pressure, water pressure, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
liquid
Mm-hmm.
pressure, right? And I think that this is where we actually have a lot of solutions that the interesting companies have been working on. We just haven't seen them. Like, you hear about NVIDIA and their structure. And when you talk about Jensen Huang, I talk about a lot is he has 60 direct reports. And yeah, that's the right reaction. How do you get 60 direct reports? It means that they are presenting to you information that is a lot more complete so that you spend less time in the hand-holding process. And the way that they're doing that is they're front ending a lot of the stage gate process by having group conversations so that all stakeholders are present. And you can allow serendipitous innovation happening because you have other people who are stakeholders who might not normally be at the table being able to participate. And the way that I see that kind of evolving is organizing teams by their skill sets and knowledge sets around a specific problem or task, and having them use consensus to get to the solution, so that entire team, whether it can be generated digitally, and then collectively are incentivized for the outcome. And I'm willing to sacrifice some of my upside to reinvest. And so I'm also using my founder's equity as this like flywheel effect, so that I can create systemic alignment in each of these tasks and each of these teams, because it's super hard to motivate and incentivize people individually when one person is compensated by their hourly rate, and another person is for the revenue, and another person is for costs, and another person is for margin, and another person is for legal liability, right? And
Mhm.
everybody's dancing with these different directions, which in theory is helping reduce risk, but in reality ends up creating a lot of blockage, because if the person who doesn't want to increase costs, they know they can just block things from being invested in. If the person who's focused on revenue doesn't think about the cost of that revenue, then they'll make you go bankrupt as faster than you can think. The lawyer is going to say no to everything because they think they're going to enter a lawsuit at any given day. And the hourly worker is going to work as long as possible on a single project, because that is job security.
Mm, mm.
Right? You start to break down what is incentivizing all these parties in these very common situations, and figure out, how do I build around this, and how do I build a system to do that, right?
Yes, yes.
I've just approached this from the lens of studying the Pepsi system for 40 years, because I was born into it. It's like I happen to be born into it. I happen to be curious, and then I've decided to take a passion project of complexity science, which I think I'm probably pretty unique in that space. But you and I both kind of share some of that love of complexity science and the world of organizational design.
Mhm.
What was the first book of complexity science that you kind of read and was like your eye opener?
Oh my gosh. What was it? It was like back in the days of like, it's chaos theory. I forget which that was that really famous chaos theory book. But
The Stuart Kaufman one,
uh,
or no? That's complex.
I was in how let me think. It must have been like 30 years ago, 35 years ago. What I'm reading right now, I don't know who the author is, but it's a it's called modularity, the power of modularity. And what it studies is it uses the PC industry as an example of the power of modularity, and how when it was structured to allow different innovators like NVIDIA to work on one part of the PC, and then someone else to work on the displays, and someone else to look on the memory, and then it invited more innovation. And for that to happen, you have to have interoperability, which allows for modularity.
Mhm.
And so I think later in their next book, I think then they are then apply it to organizations, but they use the PC industry as one example. Then I was so that's I don't know what my first book, and I don't know if that is, I don't know if that qualifies, but that's what I'm
So
really interested in.
was that Chaos Making a New Simons by James Gleick?
Good gosh, man, I was like 15 years old or something. I don't remember.
So this one originally was published in '89.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so it could be around
yeah,
then.
could be right around there. Yeah.
For me, it was actually Stephen Johnson's Emergence, and it was
Mm.
similar to chaos theory from computer science. Is they started to realize that the patterns on computer chips were mimicking the pathways of the way that ants were building their nests,
Mhm.
and they were able to layer it. And then they started to realize, well, also traffic patterns, and then all of these things that seemed unrelated were quite related. For example, Mandelbrot created an idea of a growth curve that is you hit an exponential lift, then you hit a plateau, then you hit exponential lift, and it's very stochastic in its growth, which makes sense because what it really kind of highlights in mass production is you build a big factory and now you got mass production and it reduces your cost of goods, but you're selling more goods. That efficiency is only up to a certain point until you have to do a completely new system, which then increases the efficiency another exponential level.
Okay.
So if you think about like a staircase and like your growth and over time, it's gonna not be a single
Mm-hmm.
rocket ship, but it's gonna be multiple, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Google, an example, is somebody who's had multiple rocket ship moments, and almost all of it has been revolving about around certain products that are launched and the economies of scale that they gain.
Yes.
Talking about internal innovation, we wouldn't have Gmail without entrepreneurs at Google, right?
Right.
So when you got into these books about complexity science, did you know how they would apply? Or was this just like your curiosity took you down different rabbit holes?
Yeah, I think it's more curiosity, and that it wasn't even after some serendipitous connection that would appear. It was just more curiosity and time. I wish we all had more time to read and explore and tinker. But no, there was no intention. I mean, at that time, I was planning on studying. I studied mechanical engineering and finance in college, and I thought I was going to be an engineer. And I just did finance because it was like solving simpler problems than engineering, with people who didn't know math as well as you did. So it was like kind of an easier thing to do.
You outmath them.
I outmath them, yeah. Now that doesn't that but then they out something me later, I'm sure. But certainly like on the math problem solving, it was, it was like, I mean, it was like, taking like an options class, which requires just some more complex mathematics and thinking about optionality and possible outcomes and path dependent outcomes. Like that's the kind of thing that in a mechanical system, you conceptualize and solve for early on. But in finance, it just it's just like less. I don't know. You learn it later, I guess.
Yeah. And I'm going to kind of pivot to future oriented. What are you looking forward to in the future now? Like what excites you from an
Yeah.
outlook perspective?
I guess that the three things that are interesting to me, and they're not necessarily going to fit in with what we're talking about, but that what I'm working on right now is this idea of internal idea marketplace efficiency and how do organizations try to solve it. If there's interest in what I'm writing about, then I might pursue that further. And that could be, I think that the organizational model is one lens of a solution. I think that processes are another lens. I think that culture is another lens. And then technology will enable all three of them. But so that would be, how do we increase the internal idea marketplace efficiency? The other thing that I'm working on is customer lifetime value as a metric. And what does it take for an organization to adopt that? Because I think CLV helps us overcome the short-term, long-term issue. And if companies were to manage themselves by CLV as opposed to EBITDA or revenue growth or whatever, or earnings per share this year, I think it would lead to better decisions and more sustainable companies. I also am interested in what I'm calling right now investor. We have product market fit. I think there should be investor company fit. And companies should be looking at investors, and some do. Patagonia does, for example, think about who their investors are and are their investors aligned with the goals of the company. But when you get to be a public company, you kind of just treat all investors like I'll just take any money from anyone. So that's the other area. And then the other thing that I'm working on a book right now on, is that we get bombarded as entrepreneurs get bombarded by lots of new concepts that are just old concepts with a new name. And so kind of cut through all of that. It's like, there's one vitamin, and there are different brands of vitamins, but we have people who are selling you vitamins, but they're not telling you it's vitamin. They're calling it something else. You don't know that it actually is just a core concept. So what are the key core strategic concepts that entrepreneurs who have successfully scaled companies to say 300 million, a billion, 2 billion, what are the key core concepts they use to make their decisions to sort of cut through the noise? Those are the four areas that I'm interested in right now.
Okay. And are you hopeful that those are going to see improvement? I know from a perspective of double-sided marketplace, difficulty is you have to either get customers and then you have to get basically suppliers and customers at the same time. And if you don't have enough of either one, the balance never works, right?
Yep. Yep. And employees. If you
Yeah.
can count, employees could be suppliers. Yes.
Yeah.
The willingness to pay, the willingness to sell, the top and bottom of the stick. I do think that there's a shift towards appreciating the bottom of the stick to the suppliers and employees. And we're grossly behind in thinking about selling the product of employment. Yeah.
Yes. I think a big problem is actually what we're taught in business school, where the role of employment and like if you think of salary, that's an investment into that employee to produce an output. And that output is essentially general return to the company. We
Yes.
think of most salaries actually as a cost that is historical, right? So it's one is okay, this is my fixed cost. I got to reduce that versus this is my fixed investment. How can I improve that? And I think some of the times we shortchange what we're asking of our employees or where we think our employees can contribute because we've only asked them to do the same thing over and over again. And now we're just increasing the cost of through basically natural inflation. We increase the cost of that employee and we haven't asked them to do anything differently, nor have we asked them, hey, if you were an owner of this company, what would you do? And I think that's the biggest missing opportunity for all companies today.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is being able to attribute the value to the employee. And some employees, that's easier, right? On the sales side, maybe. But the deeper you get into the organization, the harder it is to attribute the value. And so I think that like a more decentralized model where you have more profit centers interacting with each other rather than measuring profit at the very, taking the revenue at the end and subtracting for all the costs along the way. If you could do P&L at different parts, that then you can start attributing value and you can motivate employees to become entrepreneurs, become entrepreneurial, and play the games that are invigorating and exciting, and that have them make motivate to learn and to improve the game.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that delineation of profit inherently is political internally. So
Mm.
part of what you're setting up in your solution set is how do I manage the politics of internal organizations
Yes.
so that we can get people aligned.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because we do it because we set the prices, the internal prices that go into the estimation or calculation of profit are centrally defined. Like we're operating a centralized economy. Most companies do. We had this one guy who spoke to our network. His name's Tom Malone. He's a professor at MIT. He wrote a book, and he wrote this book, I don't know, 6-7 years ago called Superminds. And he said this one thing that just keeps coming back to me. So I want to make sure I attribute it to him and not me. But he said there are 5 ways that humans make decisions together. There are hierarchies, there are marketplaces, there are ecosystems, there are communities, and like communities, people will, your neighborhood community will kind of make a decision. Oh, this person doesn't cut their lawn, but it's not like it's a different way of making a decision, and there are democracies. And at the top of a company, you do have what's supposed to be a democracy where investors will vote in the board, and then the board then will influence the hierarchy from the top. Inside, you have internal marketplaces, say employee marketplaces. Oh, I really, Kaihan's really not a great worker. I don't want him to work with me, but Andy's great. Let's get him. And so you got these internal marketplaces. You certainly have communities. You have some level of ecosystems. Um, and so I think that we kind of simplify how things get done by just assuming that it's one or the other. But in any organization, I think you have all five happening, and then they can build off of each other. You don't have to choose between them. You could have people electing people who are going to participate in a marketplace, and the result of a marketplace being managed by an ecosystem or things like that.
So do you so I want to take that a step further. So do you
Oh, well.
see the world as a series of organizations that are called companies but are actually their own countries that are operating in internal and cross-border disputes all the time?
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think companies are one animal, but I do think it's interesting. I've been thinking for a while that companies could be more like countries. Like what makes you American or what makes you German or what makes you French? It's not just like where you live, it's like your identity. And then, what makes you an Apple person versus a Microsoft person? What is that self-conception that has you assigned to that? I mean, so I don't know. I think that you have for-profit companies, you have nonprofit companies, you have governments, you have societies, and there are these different animals that are part of this broader ecosystem. I haven't really thought about it much, but it does seem like companies are just one of the animals in the forest.
Yeah, I tend to think of companies first as algorithms of human capital to generate revenue.
Hmm.
And then so therefore, if you look in that lens, you think about, okay, if I add another body, how much additional value can that body bring? And over time, you want it so that each additional body increases the value contribution to the total amount more than the average before it. Does that make
Yes.
sense?
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
basically how do we keep on upskilling and how do we keep on generating more revenue with each additional person and making sure that the margin is better per revenue of each additional person.
Yeah, I guess like return on invested capital. Your invested capital are people, but probably also your assets. And you just always going to make sure that if I'm adding $1 of cost there, that I'm getting my return on that's more than $1.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the thing with assets is if we believe that AI is going to change everything and the current assets are not good enough for a future state, we know that we're going to have to change all the assets. So
Hmm.
what you end up having is a group of human capital that is able to learn, but is able to also pull from their previous experience and knowledge sets and skill sets that we frame as institutional knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. But the cost basis also of that you assign, that the company assigns to that, is also a function of the marketplace that it buys it from. It might be buying that capacity from a company that is just willing to lose billions of dollars a year on providing that because they know that there is a network effect, that if they can do the hyper growth thing and they can be the biggest at the end, that they'll eventually be able to reap the profits. So like Uber is not profitable, and will it ever be profitable? It's got to return like $30 billion to investors, but it is willing to provide you that service at a loss because it sees a payoff down the road. So you do have this marketplace that's also setting in non-sustainable price points for that input. And that messes up the math of the company, I think.
Yeah, I think Uber and let's say Starship are kind of interesting comparisons, right?
Mm.
Uber starts out with saying, "Hey, we're going to eliminate the taxi so that you can order it safely from your phone," right? And the value prop quickly becomes, "Are you cheaper than a taxi?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then we get addicted because now we're at that cheap price. But what we've also seen is as they've increased the price, ridership is not as elastic as they thought. They do see drop off, which is why they're not making the money.
As
And
inelastic.
yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
inelastic,
yeah.
right?
Yes. Yes, the switching costs are really, yeah, switching costs are really low.
Because I find myself doing this every time I go to a city. Do I ride Lyft? Do I ride Uber? And
Yeah.
now I'm adding Waymo to that list.
I haven't run over Waymo yet.
I haven't either, but every time I like go to San Francisco, the Bay Area, I get super excited until it's just about 5 minutes outside of the zone that I need to go. And
Right,
I'm not
right.
willing to
And then
walk
you need
that.
to walk, yeah. That 5-minute walk is a 30 that 5-minute drive is a 30-minute walk. The,
Yeah.
I also just look at the taxi line too. I wait before I set it up, and before I hit order, I step outside just to see how long the wait would be for a taxi. And that's not a
Yeah.
price decision, that's just a convenience decision.
Yeah. And but what we're looking at is essentially a model that in theory at scale, where it's hard to argue that they're not already at scale, should reduce in
Right.
price, but the cost per unit is actually increasing.
Mhm.
Because their model was saying, hey, if we avoid paying employees to be employees and just call them independent contractors, we'll be able to get this done because they're covering the cost of insurance, etc.
Yes.
But
Yes.
that's not really the case. What you just found is a way to make a less safe travel experience.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And so you have to think about your profitability as operating inside these other systems. If it's a two-sided system, you got the supply and demand of the customer side, but then you've got the supply and demand at the supplier side and the employee side, and the dynamics behind that could be warped as well.
Exactly. And then you look at like Starship, which is delivering food in a small robot, and the average cost is always going to go down over time because the cost of the components are cheaper every year going forward because of essentially Moore's law, and our ability to produce plastic and chips is really good these days. And
Yeah.
so you think about, one is the marginal cost of a ride goes up in Uber versus in Starship a marginal cost per delivery goes down.
Yep.
You know where it's going to end,
Yep.
right?
Because and the marginal cost to acquire a customer is not going down for the Uber.
No.
They have to reacquire that customer every time, convince you to click on Uber rather than Waze.
Yeah. Well, and they have to find different ways to remind you,
Yep.
and they are tend to be reminding you in traditional expensive media platforms,
Yes.
right? An
Yep.
Uber billboard, etc.
Yep. Yep. Which increases the acquisition cost. You're reacquiring. Yeah, you need to have scalability either as you grow, either like your input has to come down, your cost of adding value has to come down, or your cost to acquire a customer has to come down.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not scalable.
Yeah. So I bet the thing that's probably going to be the endpoint for Uber is actually going to be an acquisition. They're not going to reach profitability because their model, even
Mm-hmm.
at its current scale, is not showing that it's getting anywhere near. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And so then I guess who would value what they have built beyond the current monetization approach, beyond selling rides?
well,
Yeah.
they could do the Elon Musk and just create Uber AI and have Uber AI
Right.
buying at the full price. Like, look, this is how much more value. It's gonna be pure stock trade.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think we have plenty of talking that we've done. I
Mm-hmm.
really want to ask you one last question,
Sure.
and then after that we'll be able to end The question quite simply is this: what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for things to change, for things to take off for you, etc.? What are you waiting for?
I am waiting for a multipolar political world where the US is no longer seen by itself and by others as the game. And we start seeing competing world views and powers and approaches and standards. That's what I'm waiting for. I think it's going to open up innovation
Yeah,
for humanity.
yes, I think two-party systems all across the world have
Yeah.
consolidated into being not beneficial
Yeah.
for the societies in which they operate.
Yeah. We need more choice.
We need more choice, and we also need more diversity of thought leadership.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
because it's clearly consolidating. I totally agree. I want to thank you so much for getting onto this call and joining me on the radio.
This was
This has
awesome, Andy. Thank you.
No, thank
My
you.
pleasure.
I know sometimes we can go down deep rabbit holes that we might lose a user, a listener or two, but
Mm-hmm.
I think what we're talking about is really critical for how we build companies, countries, and communities going forward. And we are hoping to provide a platform for those discussions by just asking people what motivated them to do the things that they do and what are they doing today to kind of help communities, companies, and countries. So thank you
Interesting.
very much. This has been another episode of What Are You Waiting For by Godot. I'm host Andy Weinstein. We had Kaihan Krippendorff on board. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.